What's up everyone, Maki here with an impression review of Alwa's Awakening, a retro-inspired puzzle platformer that actually understands why people liked retro platformers. If you are a fan of retro-style platformers, or puzzle platformers more specifically, and I mean honestly a fan of them, then you will absolutely love this game for a number of reasons. However, for literally anybody else, that is a very cautionary recommendation because the game, while as a whole it is fairly good and I had a lot of enjoyment with certain sections of the game, those sections that I enjoyed were very padded out with stuff that just seems arbitrary and just sort of ended up being frustrating as a whole, which is very unfortunate because the game, like I said, as a whole is actually fairly good and ends up being a really good puzzle platformer that doesn't rely on the retro sort of mechanics. It just kind of has a retro aesthetic and ends up having a few kind of callback mechanics, which is fairly nice that a lot of people enjoy. But as a whole, I think that it might be too frustrating for a lot of people because of these mechanics, so we'll talk about a little bit later in the video. Anyways, let's go ahead and look at the settings real quick. Controls. You can edit your controller rebindings, but you can't actually edit your keyboard bindings, which is a bit strange and backwards. I used a controller, so it wasn't a big deal for me, but for people who use keyboard, that might be a little bit annoying. Luckily, the defaults work, so there you go. Audio and language, you get volume sliders, that's always nice to see, and then you also get your video. Resolution is going to be locked at these resolutions, that's so it keeps a 1:1 pixel ratio. I wish it went a little bit higher so they can end up getting a little bit more crisp, but that's what we got to deal with when you end up going with retro. You can full screen it and it will try and stretch it and give you black bars, and it'll try and look the best that it can, but it's not always going to be perfect, so I recommend playing it in window mode. Vertical sync is basically going to be your frame rate control. You got 60 and 30. I recommend 60 for obvious reasons. And then you get a magic indicator, which is a thing in game. And that's the extent of the options. There's not really much missing there because it is a retro styled game. I just kind of wish the resolution would go higher. Anyways, I'm going to go ahead and load in my save here, which is basically at the end of the game. Now, when you finish the game, it actually resets just like a NES game. And so basically, this is a save that's sort of not at the end of the game. It's just a little bit before. And for that reason, I'm not going to show the map, or I'm going to try not to. I might end up opening it from habit, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to avoid that for spoiler reasons, because it is a Metrovania game, and you are going to be exploring. And one of those Metrovania mechanics is, hey, you get save points. You also get teleport points as well. Now, right off the bat, I'm going to get with one negative point to the game. I'm going to go ahead and walk over to the teleport point just so I can show you guys. But I'm going to go ahead and say one negative point right off the bat. And the game actually starts off incredibly slow. You get your left and right movement and you get your jump and you're able to climb ladders. And that is where the game starts. And you end up having these mechanics for the first 15 minutes of the game, which is very unfortunate because they are probably the obvious ones. However, later on you find the staff, which one, you can hit enemies with it. But you can also end up summoning different sort of spells as well later on as you end up finding them in the Metrovania style. And so you end up traveling to different areas and things like that. And so there'll be like, oh, this one dungeon, and then you end up going through that dungeon and it'll have a new ability, a new item that will end up unlocking some new thing. Maybe it'll have a key for another dungeon to open up, and that actually ends up being one of the more interesting aspects of the game is these spells. And so you end up getting 3 spells throughout the game. You get a block, which ends up allowing you to summon it. You can block bullets with it. You're also able to jump over, and that's actually ends up having a few more mechanics that are fairly interesting I'm not going to talk about because, once again, I'm going to be fairly basic on these spells because I don't want to spoil any of the puzzles because that is part of actually figuring out these puzzles. But you get the blocked summon, which would be used to jump higher on things. You can also block bullets with it. And you also get a bubble, which only lasts a certain duration. And you also get a lightning bolt fairly late on in the game, which you can use as a long range thing. And it's also used for puzzles as well. And I'm not going to spoil how those end up kind of working with puzzles, except for what you end up seeing in the video, because I do want to show some of those aspects as well. Now, one complaint with this is that the lightning bolt spell ends up being your main kind of long-range combat spell, and later on in the game, it is kind of crucial. But early on in the game, you end up getting into some combat situations to where it ends up being not necessarily possible to kill certain enemies because of that. And you kind of rely heavily on sort of avoiding attacks. So, for example, I can set this block to kind of block bullets, as I was talking about, but you can end up using it as well to kind of get a little bit of extra distance or something like that. So when you end up getting this area, you're not really able to kind of first off get very far. And so you're able to like sort of figure out how to get over each different puzzle. Wow, I screwed that wording up. But regardless, it ends up being more about the sort of puzzle platforming rather than the combat. And the combat is actually fairly lacking. Your combat abilities range from hitting them with your staff or using the light bomb spell. You can also summon blocks on top of certain enemies as well. For example, I can end up squishing this little bat here with the block as well. So there are some combat abilities you can use, but once again, that is definitely not the main aspect of the game. Now, when it comes to health and stuff like that, you actually have 3 different hits, or 3 hits that you can take up in the top right. You can also find a vial where when you find a well, you're able to get 3 additional hits. It kind of acts as like a second life system. However, that ends up kind of being a major complaint later on that I'll end up talking about. And then you're also able to find several collectibles. Now, there is the unlockables, such as the items and stuff like that you'll end up finding through the game, which end up unlocking different mechanics and different spells and ends up upgrading them so they end up doing different things. But you also end up finding these blue orbs, and that is the extent of the sort of collectibles in the game. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of interesting collectibles. There are a few little secret things that I can't really talk about because, once again, spoilers. But for the most part, you end up finding these blue orbs, and the blue orbs only do one thing, it seems. And maybe it does something else that I don't necessarily know about, or maybe that doesn't necessarily explain. But when you get to a boss, it'll deal some extra damage, and that's about it. Which is fairly unfortunate that the mechanics end up being that sort of layman. It's a bit boring, and I kind of wish there was a little bit more interest in getting these collectibles, because while the bosses are actually incredibly well designed, I was talking about combat being fairly boring, the bosses are actually fairly interesting because they focus on the sort of puzzle aspects rather than the actual combat of the bosses as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and die. Now there's a lot of instant death in this game, and I'm going to go ahead and go into the negative aspects of this game, because the puzzle platforming, I wish I could show more of it and talk more about it, and obviously I'll go ahead and show you this. But here's the major complaint that I had, and this is why it was very, very cautionary. This game is a Metrovania game as well. And you will notice when I died, I went all the way back to the save point that I just started at. You go back to the last save point when you die that you end up saving at. Now, there is a positive to this. If you end up collecting things, so for example, you end up collecting a blue orb, or you end up pushing buttons or something like that, it will end up saving those when you end up going back. And so you're not necessarily stuck like going through and like, oh, well, now I got this thing. Now I got to get to a save point. Don't worry about that. When you end up dying, you keep that stuff. And that is kind of nice, but at the same time, it resets your progress. So if you end up traveling somewhere, because it is a Metrovania game, you will be traveling places a lot. It ends up setting you back so much, and it ends up being one of these situations to where platforming, the puzzle platforming and everything like that is very, very interesting. You end up having to combine different abilities to get through different areas, and you kind of figure out different sort of ways to sort of travel through different regions. But at the same time, doing it over and over again is not entertaining whatsoever. And since it is a Metrovania game that kind of focuses on different sort of aspects of this sort of mechanical aspects, I guess, I'm kind of having a hard way to sort of explain it. It focuses on the mechanics so heavily. Each area has its own sort of puzzle platforming, like it would be in a retro style game. And this is sort of one of the retro style elements to the game. It ends up being one of those situations where it's like, all right, I already know how to solve this puzzle. Solving the puzzle again is not interesting. Solving it once, yes, that's interesting, and it is actually fairly rewarding to figure out, like, oh, well, this is how I'm supposed to get through this area. This is how I'm supposed to do this, and this is how I'm supposed to defeat this boss. This is how I'm supposed to get around this enemy. It's like, oh, there's certain enemies, like, you'll run into. It's like, oh, well, this enemy just kills me no matter what, and it's, like, very frustrating and everything like that, and then you figure out, like, oh, well, I can actually use this mechanic to not get hit by him. Oh, well, I'm just an idiot and didn't figure it out, and there you go. And everything focuses around these puzzle elements, but the negative side to that is the fact that it is a sort of retro style platformer, and so you're kind of like in one of those situations to where it just isn't interesting to re-go through an area. So when you die, instead of being one of those situations where it's like, oh, well, oh, well, now I just got to try and figure out a new way, which there ends up being a fair amount of trial and error because you got to figure out how the mechanics end up working. Oops, I ended up dying, which that's unfortunate because I actually wanted to go all the way back over there. That's fine. That's not fine, but this is what I was talking about. Now it's going to end up taking me that amount of time again to just get over there and end up showing that area because I only wanted to show one thing. I didn't think I was going to die, but I ran into an instant kill spike, and that's one of the things that's actually fairly frustrating about this game is that you will run into one of those spikes, and it is not entertaining to do it over and over again. One of the other aspects is the game actually has these Metrovania elements, and they don't necessarily tell you where you're supposed to go. Now, this is a positive as well, because you're like, you're supposed to explore and figure everything out. I don't know why I'm going this way. I'm going to go the faster way, which is using my upgraded ability and doing that. I just took a hit. I'm probably going to die again, and I'm going to be very frustrated, and I'm going to have to do a cut. That's going to be annoying. But that's my main complaint about the game, is that it has these Metrovania elements as well, to where you end up having to travel, like, let's say, across the map. There's several sections of the game to where it's like, all right, it gives you a hint. It's like, oh, well, you need this ability. You need this to continue. And you're like, all right, cool. So I'm going to go try to find that ability. And I was over in the area, and I'm like, all right, well, it seems like I need something else too. So I ended up having to look at my map and be like, all right, well, what am I missing? And so I ended up traveling in these different areas, and I'm like, all right, well, finally found this thing, and I finally found the one thing I was missing. And it doesn't necessarily give you enough direction, I feel. A lot of other Metrovania games, at least in the modern era, have ended up having some sort of guideline that you can end up following. And the Metrovania elements ended up being more interesting in the way that they sort of ended up locking this out. Now, this is sort of a retro design element kind of put into play, and a lot of people are going to enjoy that, myself included. I will say that I was fairly fond of the idea of kind of exploring and figuring things out. However, the death mechanic that I was just explaining ended up being extremely frustrating, and here is what really, really killed it for me. About halfway through the game, I got stuck. And the reason for this is because it actually wasn't because I wasn't figuring out what I was supposed to do, but rather because I needed to find a secret to end up actually making progress. So this is going to be a secret I'm going to spoil for you guys, because I don't feel bad for spoiling it whatsoever. So behind this waterfall right here, there's a secret. Right in the middle of the waterfall, there's a secret door. You're like, cool, that's a secret. I like secrets. Secrets are cool. The game has a lot of secrets, and that's how you get most of the blue orbs. And that's really cool. This secret's required to actually progress through the game. Now, there are certain sections of the game that are actually designed fairly well to where it's like, oh yeah, I gotta find something, because you end up being in this pit to where you're not able to actually progress anywhere, and you're like, all right, well, how am I supposed to get by this? And you end up kind of just, it promotes you to explore, which is really, really cool. And that's something that a lot of games don't do, especially these days. And that is sort of a retro element that I actually enjoy about the game quite a lot. And I'm actually really, really fond of that aspect alone. However, there are other aspects to where they did not design them particularly well. They made an area and it's like, all right, well, what am I supposed to do in this area? I don't know. And so you end up going in that area and it's not explained in any way, shape, or form. And it's just like, all right, well, I missed something. And you can end up spending a long time just sort of exploring an area to where it has absolutely no indication of where I'm supposed to go or what you're supposed to do. And it's just like, oh, I had to walk behind a waterfall and just hit up in the right exact spot. And the even more frustrating part about this is the first time I did that, I found that waterfall and I'm like, all right, you know what? There's going to be a secret behind this. And I bet that's exactly what I'm missing. I went behind the waterfall and pushed up in every single spot that I possibly could. And I just missed exactly where I needed to push. You have to be exactly in the center of the waterfall for it to work, to be able to enter that door. And so I just kind of like went through the waterfall. You can't see yourself because it ends up obstructing your view. And so I walked around and I'm like, all right, well, I don't see where I'm actually supposed to go. All right, whatever, I'll continue on. And that's where it ended up becoming a mistake, because it's like, all right, well, this waterfall doesn't do it either. Whatever, there's nothing here. Turns out I needed that to progress through the freaking game. That's not cool. And it didn't really give me any hits otherwise as well. Like maybe there's an NPC somewhere in this sort of arcane area. Maybe it's an NPC in another secret. For example, to find out you needed a special key thing for one specific dungeon, you had to find a secret to find a person who tells you how to find that key. And it's like, all right, why did this have to be a secret? So that is another complaint as well. Now, some people are going to find that as like positive. They're like, oh, well, now I got to explore every nook and cranny. And that is actually a benefit to the game. But that is also why it is a cautionary recommendation to literally anybody else, because a lot of people are not going to find that mechanic necessarily interesting. Oops, I ended up getting hit, which kind of went into the sort of graphical element of the game we'll talk about in a minute. But I ended up using my water of life thing or whatever the hell they ended up calling it. So I ended up getting my 3 hits back. But regardless, that is my main complaint with the game. Now, there are a few other minor complaints as well, such as the combat not being particularly interesting. Having to play through certain areas is not very interesting. And the fact that some of the puzzles as well are just sort of basic as well. So for the first 50% of the game, I never felt like I was challenged in any way. And luckily, the last sort of 25% of the game is extremely challenging, and that's when the game is actually really, really interesting. But I felt like the game was mostly too easy for the most part. And bosses specifically, while bosses were very, very well designed, and there are some very well designed areas, such as, for example, there was an area to where you're supposed to find a secret, and instead of actually just being like, all right, well, we're just going to put it behind a waterfall like that. That was probably the one example to where that was ended up being sort of designed poorly. They sort of hint at it and be like, all right, well, now you're in this sort of spot to where there's literally nothing. And you're just stuck. There's like a wall here and a wall there. The only way you're able to do something is like, oh, well, I got to do that. And so you're just like, all right, well, I'll just deal with that. And it's like, oh, well, that didn't end up happening. And it's something unexpected happened instead. And it's like, oh, well, that was a secret. And then I think they use that to sort of justify using secrets in the future as a sort of way to progress, which I feel like was the wrong direction to go. I feel like that actually negatively impacted the game. Now let's go ahead and talk about graphics and sound for a minute. Sound-wise, the game sounds retro. Visually, the game looks retro, and they did a very, very good job at it. It looks like a retro-style platformer in a very good sense. It's not bad, it looks retro. Now, some of the animations are fairly basic, and I feel like that was to kind of capture that retro style. However, the sound is absolutely perfect. It sounds like a retro game in every right way. Nothing about it ends up sounding bad, and the music I absolutely adore. I absolutely love the soundtrack to this game. I think it is absolutely fantastic for being a chiptune music thing. So I do want to point that out. It is an absolutely fantastic soundtrack, and the sound effects and everything like that are what you would expect from a retro game. And so if you are looking for that retro experience, you are going to find it with this title, and that is actually really, really interesting, and I really, really think they did a great job with it in every aspect that they possibly could. That said, while the puzzle platforming and everything, that I should reiterate because I've been negative for a little bit here, the puzzle platforming and everything like that is fantastic, and there are a lot of interesting puzzles. Yes, it does take a little bit to kind of build up the interesting puzzles, but they end up using all of the abilities, kind of combining them, especially in the later dungeons where you end up having to use different abilities. The bosses, you'll have to use all of your abilities and try to figure out different ways to kind of solve different things, and everything is about solving puzzles, not necessarily about your skill level. And so the skill ceiling is not necessarily high. It is enough to sort of challenge you and, challenge your brain. But at the same time, everything is sort of held back by those sort of Metrovania elements. For example, one area that I absolutely hated about the game was you went from one side of the map and it's like, oh, well, you got to go talk to this one person for this one thing. You're like, all right, cool. So you go to the other side and it's like, oh, well, you didn't do this. Now, fortunately, I did it coincidentally, but if you didn't do it, it's like, oh, well, now you got to travel all the way back to the other side of the map, and then you got to travel back to that side of the map. And this is one of those mechanics where it's absolute padding, and it just feels arbitrary. It's like, oh, well, now you got to go find this one person, this one specific spot, and it's like, all right, cool. And then you go find that one specific person in that one specific spot. Go ahead and refill my water of life because I'm inevitably going to die. But that is the major holdback for the game. So as a conclusion, the game itself is really, really good, and I actually like it quite a bit. It ends up being a fairly decent platformer, and I really like the idea that they kind of had this sort of caster. The story itself, as I didn't really talk about too much in here, because the story is fairly threadbare. There is some story, and you kind of get a little bit of what's going on through the different characters, and each boss has its own sort of introduction and talks about what's going on. It's like, oh, well, blah, 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 and you're like, all right, cool. So you get little bits of story, but the game definitely doesn't focus on it, and some people did sort of draw that as a negative, but I don't necessarily feel like it needed it, and it does sort of have a mystery element to it, which I actually enjoyed a fair amount. However, overall, the story isn't necessarily important. And as a conclusion, the art, the sort of aspects and the design and everything like that is definitely retro, and it feels fantastic to play. And I feel like they did a great job making a retro-inspired game that understands why people liked retro-style platformers. And that is actually extremely surprising, and I'm really, really glad that I enjoyed it the amount that I did. But I am very, very unfortunate to say that a lot of the time that I spent on this game wasn't actually me enjoying it. Most of it was me getting frustrated at just having these sort of sections to where it's like, oh, I just ran into another instant kill thing when I know exactly what I have to do. Also, when you use magic, you have to wait for it to recharge as well. That's another puzzle element I didn't speak about. Sorry, I kind of skipped over that. But regardless, it's unfortunate to say that I'm having trouble recommending the game, because while I enjoy it and I think that it's an absolutely fantastic retro platformer, that major negative point of the sort of Metrovania and sort of retro style design elements that sort of hold it back can actually destroy the game for me. And it could end up destroying the game for everyone else as well. It's one of those things to where I got partway through the game. I'm like, all right, well, I plan to do a review of it because I was like, all right, it's a retro game that actually is retro. And I ended up seeing that, and I got my first ability and I started playing through the puzzle platforming sections. I'm like, oh, right, this is actually going in a really good direction. But it was not a very long time before I was like, all right, I'm frustrated at this Metrovania stuff. It should not have been a Metrovania game. And I think it would have been a lot better if they would have made it more level-based or made it more easy to teleport around. There are those teleporters, but those teleporters are not very common. Only a few of the save points actually have teleport points. And as you can see in that sort of map list thing, or where it said like the teleport points, those are all the teleport points for the entire map, and they're not enough. You can get sort of in the general area of something, but it's not close enough to actually get to where you want to go. And then let's say you get to that teleport point and you're like, all right, I teleported, and then you save, and then you end up dying. And it's like, all right, well, now I got to redo all of that over again. And it's just, yeah, I know I've harped on it over and over, and I probably should end at that, but like, that is the major complaint. So if you can overlook that and you want a good retro style platformer, Alwa's Awakening is absolutely fantastic. It is a really, really good game. And no, it's not going to be like something that's going to blow your mind or anything like that. It is retro in the sort of way that it is a retro platformer, but it's a really good retro platformer. So if you like retro platform, oops, I just teleported exactly the same place. If you like retro platformers, you'll enjoy this game a lot. You might get frustrated at times, but for the most part, it is an enjoyable experience. However, if you don't like retro platformers and you're looking for another good platformer, I'd probably hold off on Alwa's Awakening because it's too frustrating to recommend to anybody who's not really into the genre. So there's my conclusion. Anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Michael with an impressions review of Alwa's Awakening. It is a fairly decent retro platformer, and I really wish I could recommend it to everyone, but I just can't because of those frustrating elements. And it is retro, and a lot of people are not going to like the retro aesthetic. You know, once again, that is going to be something that is subjective. But anyways, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more content like this one. You can also check out my other impressions reviews, such as the last one that I did was for Ori and the Blind Forest, which was another Metrovania platformer that was a little bit modern and ends up kind of lacking on the Metrovania elements, but is actually a really, really good platformer. So if you're looking for a platformer that's maybe not retro, you can end up checking that one as well. So that's a fairly decent one as well, but it is more fast-paced and it is more skill-reliant. But yeah, you can end up checking out that review as well. You can also end up checking out my topic videos, my Let's Plays, and other types of stuff that I do. I'm always doing something interesting. But for the most part, that has been Alwa's Awakening. Make sure to give your thoughts in the comment as well. Do you think that I'm wrong in these sort of sections? Is there something that I'm missing? Is there some sort of save mechanic that I'm missing? Is there a save state system? I know that I play a lot of retro platformers on stuff like emulators because it's like, I want a save state system. If I'm playing through one of those classic platformers, I don't want to have to go through the whole save point, or let's say I have 5 lives and then I have to restart the game from scratch because like I just died 5 times. I think that's frustrating, and I think those are the elements from retro platformers I'm not a fan of. However, everything else, I love the original kind of ideas. I don't mind the sort of downtime that's in between areas, such as, you know, going through areas, and that is sort of my major complaint with this game. It's just the amount of downtime, because when you die, you're not really necessarily gaining anything from going through different areas. You're just kind of like, yeah, you just sort of went through a different area. Also, I could have stayed on that and gotten a secret. Anyways, so yeah, that's it. But anyways, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. And hopefully you end up looking at Alwa's Awakening positively after this video. I was super negative for a while there, so I apologize for that one. But yeah, it's just, I don't know if I'm going to revisit this one ever again because of those frustrating elements. I'm always going to remember, it's like, oh yeah, I died, and then I got reset, and it's like, whatever.